Well, guys, we are 78 days away from the election, and hardly any time really until early voting happens. And of course, there are plenty of problems that are potentially going to arise along the way in terms of voting, in terms of our postal system, in terms of the pandemic. But what we're going to do this week, just as a preface for the week, we are going to try to break down how the DNC functions, why it exists, what's the purpose of it in relation to the movement, what's the history of the Democratic Party, what is the history of the conventions. We're going to talk to DNC members today. We're going to talk to DNC members all week, longtime DNC reformers and activists, some of the fights that have happened over the last 40, 50, even 70 years back. We are going to talk about the history so that we can learn from it, because history does repeat itself. You'd be shocked that there was a convention that was very similar to the one in 2016 about 60, 70 years ago. We will be talking about a lot of the background of the DNC. On today's show, we are first going to do an interview with author Thomas Frank. You may know him from What's the Matter with Kansas, Listen Liberal. He is going to talk about the changing of course of the Democratic Party. For those who are not old enough to remember, in the late 70s, early 80s, the Democratic Party shifted its way. It used to be the party of workers. There was a vibrant, progressive coalition in the Democratic Party, and for many reasons that Thomas Frank will explain, it shifted away from workers and more towards corporate interests. And that gave rise to the New Democrats, the Third Way, the DLC, whatever you want to call them, they're the same people, inside the party and inside of leadership. They started investing in lawmakers and politicians and leaders that would put out this neoliberal philosophy, which was a global philosophy. So Thomas Frank is going to highlight that. And then later on the show, we're going to have a panel where we're talking about the money of the Democratic Party. We have investigative reporter David Moore. We have chairman of the New Hampshire Democratic Party who ran for DNC chair and was the first person to talk about how the budget of the DNC really was never put forth before the executive committee of the DNC. We'll talk about that a little bit more depth. That's Ray Buckley, Chairman Ray Buckley. And then we have activist Selena Vickers. She has been tirelessly showing up at every single meeting, shining light on the meetings, asking the tough questions. Trust me, these meetings are really hard to get to and very hard to learn about. And she's really taken in her power to give folks access to what happens behind closed doors. Because whether we appreciate the Democratic Party or not, whether we think that there should be another way, a third party, it exists. And it clearly has the power of the ballot line. And the way that the Democratic Party functions, which we will elaborate on all week, is it is still a corporation. And we have a two-party system in this country, and one of the parties that represents progressives and working people is not fully democratic, is not fully transparent, it does not have full accountability and oversight. I think a lot of you may know that I was on the DNC's Unity Reform Commission, which came out of the 2016 election. That came out of a negotiation between Senator Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. And in that commission, they decided that it was time to reform the party. There were a lot of issues that had been brought up during the primary cycle, that presidential primary cycle, that were old issues that had been brought up many times within the Democratic Party, within its membership, relating to superdelegates, relating to caucuses and primaries, and relating to how the money that the DNC raises from people like you, and big donors as well, gets allocated. And so on this commission, we spent pretty much 2 years running around the country, investigating, going through hearings, trying to figure out how essentially the Democratic Party lost over 1,100 seats during the Obama tenure. Now, just some basic facts. If there is a Democratic president, they are effectively in charge of the DNC. So they usually choose who the chair is. The first chair election in recent history, in the last 20 years, happened right after Hillary Clinton lost her election. In 2017, in February, Tom Perez, the chairman of the DNC, assumed power. It was a pretty heated election. It lasted for about 2.5, 3 months. Keith Ellison was Bernie Sanders' choice, and there were many other DNC chair, candidates like Pete Buttigieg, and then there were vice chair candidates as well. Now, all this stuff is like really wonky, and I think there is a real argument to be made about why should it matter. Ultimately, it matters because you do have over 400 members of the DNC who run for office, who raise money in their states, and every state has a different Democratic Party. And those state parties are scale from being New York, very closed, very old school, very machine, to Washington State, which is more open and vibrant. And so all of these states function differently. They all have a different amount of resources. They all have different rules. And if you're a member of your state's Democratic Party, you're a member of the DNC as a whole. And so you have this mashup of DNC members who have different values and beliefs and got there in different ways that think that they're part of a party that has democracy. But then there are these things called committees. And the committees have functions. It could be the rural committee, the ethnic committee, it could be the youth council, it could be the women's council. But the big ones that will come up many times throughout this week in conversation these are the standing committees of the Democratic National Committee that also have a committee in the convention, the Rules Committee. And this is where, the real work is done. And that is where the chairman appoints people that are not elected to essentially establish the rules and oversee the rules and reforms of the Democratic Party. So one of the things that we're going to talk about today is why progress is halted and thwarted. And it's not even just progress. It's not just progress, the platform. It's why is this party allowed to get away with certain things? Why did they have superdelegates for so long? Why is it that the primary process of the presidential election was so geared towards the candidate who could poll the highest at certain moments with certain polls that the DNC chose, deemed the polls that they would look at? Why is it that certain people got on the debate stage and others didn't? Why is it that it was based on fundraising? Why is it that you had some candidates who got more airtime than others? And a lot of this lies in how the rules are interpreted. And if the rules of a party that is supposed to be democratic are interpreted by appointed members, then that is where the crux of this so-called Democratic Party is not so democratic. The crux, like the actual roots of the party should be with the people, right? But unfortunately, it's still top down. So I know a lot of you guys are going to ask, why? Why do we even waste our time on this? As someone who's been part of this for a long time, I do think that there are some fights worth having and some not worth having. I think that Bernie Sanders has leverage in some ways, and in other ways, it's a waste of energy putting his energy into certain committees. But during the convention, which is being held this week, you're going to see the Democratic Party and its staff really exercise how they feel about progressives. And when I say progressives, I just want to reiterate, these are working people. This is a party, I think we actually have to stop saying progressives altogether. I think we should talk about how the DNC apparatus is not respecting working people. Thomas Frank is going to get to the heart of that. But, let's just sum up what today is. Right now, we have the worst health crisis since the 1918 flu, the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. Inequality was worse before COVID, and we don't even know what it's going to be like after COVID and through COVID. We have the biggest social justice movement since, take your pick, the 19th Amendment and the enfranchisement of women in 1920, but certainly at least since the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And each of these events independently transformed politics, but it's happening all at once. The Depression ushered in a new Democratic coalition, a New Deal coalition that dominated the country's this country's politics until the 60s, in which it fell apart. You had movements that were crushed, movements that were sabotaged, and you had a party that really weighed in on these movements. So how are we going to do things differently this time around? 2020 is a more disruptive moment than any of those past times. Anything could come from this. And of course, we are sitting here in a moment in which the convention, which used to be theatrics, is basically like the most extreme and extraordinary form of theatrics. It's happening over Zoom. During the Unity Reform Commission, and during one of the DNC meetings, a bunch of different cities actually, put together campaigns on who was going to host the convention. You had Miami. They literally chartered a yacht off the River, no joke, in which they tried to woo. They bought food and had, a Cuban band, and they wanted to woo DNC members to vote for having the convention in Miami. And then you had Milwaukee talk about how workers, and in particular Wisconsin, was ignored in the 2016 election. Ultimately, they won, and they were able to get the contract for the convention. So you have a lot of hotels and workers who are depending on this convention coming to town, and it is not a convention, a real-life convention. So this is unlike anything you've ever seen. If you were not watching the 2016 convention, if you haven't watched previous conventions, I just decided to bring a prop out because I have a ton of signs in my closet. But I thought that this was actually the best one because these were, for the most part, these were all my press passes and delegates passes and activist passes from 2016. And half of these are from the conventions. So none of that is happening this time around. We're hearing how people aren't getting press passes, but the joke is, what do you have to see? It's all over Zoom. So I'm excited to talk about the convention this week. I hope you tune in. Make sure to click like and subscribe on YouTube. If you're not a patron already, please join us on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. We are able to put the show together. And I'm guaranteed, guys, we have really great guests this week. I will give you a teaser at the end of the show. You'll definitely want to subscribe. And if you can help invest in our show on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show, that is what makes this happen. And if you're into swag, we have swag at thenomikishow.com, mugs, bags, tote bags, and stickers. Thanks for watching and listening to The Nomiki Show. But remember to click like and subscribe on YouTube, and please share on social media. If you're not already a patron, please join us for as low as $5 a month on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show for early and special content. That investment makes a huge difference. We are not corporate media raking in the dough. It's really you guys that are keeping us going. So please consider being a patron. And to our current patrons, thank you so much. We are incredibly grateful to you. We also now have swag. So check us out on thenomikishow.com to get your mugs, your totes, and your stickers.